Everyone, welcome back. So today I wanted to experiment a little bit with techniques to draw some graveyards. And I wanted to do some misty graveyards and see if the techniques I've used in the last couple of videos with misty trees and landscapes could apply to doing these graveyards. So this first part of the video, it's pretty sped up. It's sped up to 4 times the regular speed. So here I'm just establishing a very sort of impressionistic, I'm really into these impressionistic, loose, very suggestive landscapes where it's really just, wet and wet technique. So I'm just dribbling the paint onto the paper, letting it kind of decide what it wants to do. I'm not being very manipulative with the paint, literally just wet the entire paper, and I'm splashing some greens, some ochres, this purple suggestion of a sky. I did add some purple into the grass. I think one thing that's important to note is that change up your hues a little bit, change up your colors. You'll notice the sky is never just blue, the clouds are never just white or silver, the ground is never just green. There are so many colors, so many shades in all these natural forms, and adding just a little bit of an unexpected color can make those look much more realistic. Okay, so here you can see I am starting to add some distant graves and like a little house-like structure in the cemetery, and I'm using the exact same technique that I use when I'm doing misty mountains, like distant hilltops, distant trees. The paper is still very wet, so when I use sort of a suggestion of a brush in those areas, it creates this amazing effect. So I've got this a very small brush and very faint sort of burnt umber loaded onto the brush, but it's very faint, as you can see. And because it's still so wet, it really does produce a misty effect. Although if you notice at the bottom of these tombstones, if I have too much definition, I go in and I push up with the brush a little bit to get it to fade into the wet paper, which makes it look like there's mist along the floor of this, along the ground of this graveyard. So you'll see that all the ones that I defined a little better are closer to the foreground. See that? There we go. I'm pushing up to try to create that misty effect. It's very easy. It's a very simple technique. We've got some tombstones closer. Again, they're going to be larger, of course, because they're closer. And I'm going to be pushing on the bottom of those in a second also to create that misty effect. And it's very effective. I mean, all I did, this was a very simple technique. All I did was make sure the paper was wet, that I created the suggestion of sky and ground. And now I'm adding these slightly more well-defined shapes. Again, because the graves, as soon as they get closer to me, they're going to be a little bit darker and better defined. I'm trying not to make them just completely uniform. I'm trying to give it the feel of like an old cemetery that's fallen to that sort of wonderful neglect that lends itself to those old romantic cemeteries. So see, here you go. Here, all I'm doing is pushing up at the bottom of the graves to make it look like there's mist along the ground, and that they're sort of rising out of the mist. And there is nothing like that, seeing a cemetery on a foggy day, especially if it's kind of a pastoral cemetery like this one. Like this one doesn't give me any kind of ominous feeling. This one actually gives me a feeling of, it's just peaceful, it's placid, it's, I can imagine sort of stumbling upon it on a golden afternoon, and there's just this old, peaceful, graveyard. And I imagine that building in the distance, I mean, that might be an old church. It might be sort of the ruins of an old church, or maybe a still functional old church. But again, I'm trying to leave plenty of room. If you can see there, sort of on the left side of the page, how much white space, how much negative space there is. I'm trying to let that be sort of the mist to the eye. I'm letting the eye sort of assume that that's just the fog. And one thing I want to note is that I also have the option when I'm making mist or fog to go back in with gouache and sort of paint over existing paint and to add this white misty feeling, but it never looks the same. It never, ever looks the same. It's always great that it's an option, But adding gouache later, I always prefer to just do it from the beginning with the watercolors because it just looks so much more authentic. I always, if I have to resort to gouache, I often get frustrated. Sometimes it looks great, but, and I'm adding the suggestions of trees here. I want to do the same thing. I don't want to draw the trees all the way down to their bottoms, down to their trunks. I want to make sure that I give the impression that they're rising out of that mist, the same mist that's sort of covering the graveyard. So I'm just focusing on their very tops. And again, see how faint those trees are. I mean, they're barely there. So it's really just the suggestion of branches. And here I decided to, I'm going to link the photo that I found online that had this beautiful Celtic cross in a cemetery. And the layout of the picture was slightly similar to this one. I mean, it's very different, but I'm probably going to try to paint a version of that, of what's in that photograph at some point, like a more close approximation at some point soon, just because it's the neatest photograph. But I will link it below so you can see what it looks like. But here we've got a Celtic cross. Again, I don't want it to be too dark, too well defined, but I do want it to, you know, stand out as being closer to the foreground. So it is a little bit darker. And I love these granulating watercolors because they always give the effect of like old stone. So they're perfect for anything, you know, any stone structure. So again, just adding some more misty graves. And then, you know, I'm adding a differently shaped tombstones in the background too, because we're going to have some tall, some short, some crumbled and low and dilapidated, and some that are still sort of standing and regal. I'm doing the same process, same technique. If you wanted to, you could just practice that technique by itself, whether it's with a tree shape or a graveyard shape, but the technique of drawing something on slightly wet, damp paper. And then if you want the bottom to have the effect of looking as though it's standing in a sort of cloud bank or a foggy ground, just pushing up on the paint under it so that the bottom of whatever structure it is not really well defined. It really works nicely. So here I'm adding the circle to the Celtic cross. It's on the bottom. You're going to see that I do eventually darken all of that. I'm trying to add some light components by giving the left sides of the graves sort of a shadow. And then I do end up making this circle, parts of it significantly darker in there so that we can see some contrast. So a lot of this picture doesn't really have much contrast yet, and it's nice to just have that little bit have some contrast, have it stand out. And I really feel that Celtic cross adds to that sort of very peaceful feeling of this cemetery, this very, very pastoral, lovely feeling. And again, the darker and more contrasted I make parts of this Celtic cross, the more it makes the misty distance stand out, the more it emphasizes how far away that little house structure is and the distant graves are and the trees are. So I really like the effect this ended up having. And again, it is the Daniel Smith granulating. This was one of the Primatech colors. And because it's a Primatech color, it really granulates, which is lovely. So there was a lot, I think all of these actually are Primatech in this picture. So there was a lot that I didn't have to do because the texture was automatically added with the paint. But again, it's very easy to do this kind of picture, especially if you build up from the distance in. Like if you know, start with the suggestion of your ground, the suggestion of your sky. If you want to make it a misty, give a misty effect to the picture, you can make sure that you don't over define the horizon line. And then you just start adding faint shapes into that white mist and sort of build towards yourself, build closer and closer. And the closer you get to yourself as the painter, as the viewer, the more contrast you're going to add to these items. So I think that's where I left it. And then I'm going to show you what it looks like now, the finished version. So there we go. That's what it looks like. It's just a very small page. It's very quick, very simple. I used a lot of these lovely earthy colors. I love the mix of green and the lavender. It really adds something. So, all right, so we're moving on now. Now I wanted to do sort of another type of graveyard, a creepy one. Or not creepy, but darker, more ominous, more frightening. Um, I really do love a good cemetery. So let's see here. I just kind of did the very quick outline of a few graves. What I did do is I put masking fluid over the tops of these graves to ensure that they would stay at least a little bit white, and I wouldn't have to worry about it. I didn't put masking fluid all over them. And here again, I am using again Primatech Daniel Smith watercolors, and this is 140-pound cold press Arches paper. Um, and I'm really just playing. I'm creating this misty effect. I'm seeing how well could this possibly work. You see what I've done? I mean, even just with these few strokes, I've kind of tried to establish that it's misty ground, and it's nighttime, and these graves are standing um, in this fog. And so by sort of once the paper was damp, sort of adding those blotches of just water into the dampened paint, it's giving texture to the sky. This sort of accidental lovely thing that happened there in the upper left, I can already see just looking at it, it looks like a forest to me. It looks like a woods, and I know because of that I'm going to play with it. I'm going to end up playing with it. So I'm emphasizing behind this one of the closer graves. I'm adding these lovely granulating, I think that's hematite that I'm adding there because it gives this amazing sort of granite look when it dries. And again, I don't want the graves themselves to stand out too much. I like that they're white. I like that it's the surroundings that are sort of the highly contrasted factors here. And then, so here begins the great fun of this particular graveyard. Is this was so cool. So because of just the way I happened to blotch the paint on there, this was not intentional. I had no intention of making a forest here. But it was this happy serendipitous accident that the distance ended up looking like a woods, and even that it almost looked like the moon is shining through the trees there in the background, that the moon is sort of in the upper left there. Um, so I was just using a very small brush to kind of emphasize these tree-like shapes rising out of the distance. And honestly, if I think about overpainting or not, if I think about that, then I could look at this and say that I could have stopped close to here. I could have stopped right around here and just left it if I were doing a very impressionistic, suggestive painting of a graveyard. And I kind of wish I had. So take a note of where I am right now in this picture. And again, I would have stopped right here and just kind of left it alone. But I was having so much fun with these trees that I just kept going. And as you can see, I'm defining them. I'm not even using any paint really. I'm using the paint that's already there to kind of pull up and draw these tree trunks. And then the super fun part is what I did was I started using just water because it's very damp, and I was creating these lighter trunks in the distance, which was so much fun. So again, I was just having a blast. I was basically just pushing the existing paint around on the paper. I don't have any paint on my brush right now other than what I'm picking up. And so this is one of the only reasons I don't regret having fact that I kept going, because this tree was so much fun to do. I mean, these roots, these twisted roots, just pushing up on the paint and emphasizing these ghostly, gnarled, pale, skeletal trees in the distance was so much fun. And here's another place I honestly probably could have stopped and just left the ground misty, just left it alone, left it as it is. But again, all of drawing is always a learning experience, always, always a learning experience. If I do something like this again, which I'm sure I will, I'm just going to leave it as it was. So here's what it ended up looking like towards the end. I'm probably going to work with the floor of the forest there and return it back to sort of its original white misty glory. But I do love the trees. I do love all that. So thanks so much, guys, for watching. And if you like what you saw, please like and subscribe. And I will see you here next week, hopefully with the project that's going to combine and integrate a lot of the techniques I've been exploring recently. So I'm excited for that. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye.